Hello, everybody. My name is Ishan Najib. I'm son of Dr. Najib, and this is my attempt at teaching life sciences. Today, we're going to be talking about the sign of love, the heart. And this lecture was primarily going to be about cardiac cycle. As you can see that I've drawn tiny little mini creatures, the heart, and one of them is under construction. But I thought that it's very important if you could have a basic overview and introductory session in which we could discuss the basic terminology, anatomical terminology, about the basic structures and functions of the heart. Now, I have drawn a diagram of a human heart over here, and I have already labeled it for the sake of saving time. Now, without further ado, let's dive right into the lecture. First, let's talk about the four chambers of the heart. So, what we will be discussing, let's first have a little bit of summary. We will be first discussing the four chambers of the heart. Then I will talk about the four valves of the heart. I will also talk about the cardiac muscle that is surrounding the heart, all three layers of it. I will talk about the electrical conduction system, the pacemaker cells that are primarily responsible for the contractions to efficiently direct the blood flow in the right direction through the heart. And then we'll talk about the difference between the arteries and veins. But now let's start with the chambers. So the heart has four chambers, two upper chambers called the atriums and the two lower chambers called the ventricles. The atriums always receive the blood and the ventricles always pump out the blood. Another thing that you need to understand is that the atriums are a low pressure system, which means that the pressure generated inside the atriums is a lot less or a lot lower than the pressures generated into the ventricles. And the reason for that is because the atriums only need to pump the blood from the atriums into the ventricles, but the ventricles need to pump blood at a much higher distance. Well, depending on which ventricle we are talking about, but it's still less than the atriums. In this case, for example, the left side of the heart, the left ventricle needs to pump the blood in the systemic circulation, which is essentially your entire body, from your head to your ears up to your toe, basically your entire body. But in the case of your right ventricle, it only needs to pump your blood to your lungs. So if your heart is placed right here, your heart is a hollow muscular organ which is present in your thoracic cavity. So if your heart is present right here in the middle, well, slightly tilted towards the left, the right atrium needs to pump blood only to the lungs. So if your lungs are present over here and your heart is placed over here, I'm talking about the lungs, right? Then it's not as far as much that the blood needs to be pumped. So that brings me to my next point, that you can see that the muscle mass that you can see is a lot, there's a higher muscle mass that is present on the left side compared to the left side. Now why is that? Right side. Now why is that? Because the left ventricle needs to pump the blood to your entire body in the systemic circulation, which means it needs a muscle, cardiac muscle, that needs to strongly contract and generate an extremely high pressure system and pump the blood into the aorta, which we'll discuss further. What about the systemic circulation? Whereas the right ventricle only needs to pump the blood into your lungs. Now let's discuss about the atriums and then the ventricles. On the left side, we can see that the left atrium and the right atrium, left atrium and the left ventricle is divided by a valve. Now this valve is called the mitral valve, but it's also called the bicuspid valve because it has two cusps. So the structure of the valve is somewhat like this, that if it's one cusp is like this and the other cusp is like this, so it opens and shuts just like that. And this is why it's called a bicuspid valve. Now the function of the valve that you need to understand is to make sure one-way direction, one-way flow, blood flow in your heart. For example, we don't want when the blood from the atrium goes into the ventricles and the ventricles contract, the blood regurgitates back into the atriums. Now as we go deeper into the lecture, or further into the lecture, we'll discuss about the concentration gradients, the pressure gradients, which are primarily responsible for opening and closing of these valves. Because if these valves don't close properly and ventricles contract and the valve is still open, that is called a regurgitation, and that's a pathology. But here we're talking about the basic physiology. This is a normal functioning heart and we don't have any pathology here. So the atriums are basically pumping the blood into the ventricles, well, both atriums, and the ventricles are pumping the blood into the arteries. Now, what is the difference in arteries and veins? That is something that we need to discuss. Maybe you already know that, some of you might not know that. Well, any blood vessel that is bringing the blood towards the heart or bringing the blood closer to the heart is called vein, and any blood vessel that is taking the blood away from the heart is called an artery. So if something, let's consider an example on the right side of the heart, right? I'm just going to briefly overview all the diagram, all the basically labels that I've done, so then we'll go into further detail. You know that the vena cava that is present on the right side of the heart is primarily responsible for draining the blood that is coming to your right side of the heart. Now this is the deoxygenated blood, which means that it is poor in oxygen, and that is why it's traditionally drawn in blue, even though the blood is still red, but we just draw it in blue. Now, vena cava is the largest vein present inside your body. Now, it is divided into two. We have a superior vena cava and we have the inferior vena cava. Now, the superior vena cava is basically responsible for draining the blood from the upper half of your body. For example, your shoulders, your ears, your head, and all that. And the inferior vena cava is responsible for draining the blood from the bottom of your body, lower half of your body. Now, what happens is that the atriums receive the blood and the ventricles pump the blood. Now, once we're done with that, let's talk about the valves. We talked about the mitral valve on the right side. Now, let's talk about which valve is present on the right side to make sure that there is properly one-way blood flow present between the right side also. Now, the valve that is present on the right side, that is called the tricuspid valve. And that valve is called tricuspid because it has three cusps. Now, I have only two hands, so I cannot show you three cusps at the same time, but consider this, that we have one cusp like this, one cusp like this, and one cusp like this. So basically, it's three cusps that's opening and shutting close, and that is why it's called the tricuspid valve. Now let's talk about the major blood vessels that are leaving the heart or taking the blood away from the heart, because obviously you need to understand that the primary function of the heart is basically to pump the blood through the vessels of your body and provide nutrition to the cells, and the blood that is coming into the heart eventually needs to be going out of the heart too. Now, like we discussed earlier, that the vessels that take the blood away from the heart are called the arteries. So it means that the ventricles are pumping the blood into the arteries, not into the veins. Now, the left ventricle pumps the blood into the aorta, and the right ventricle pumps the blood into the pulmonary artery. Okay? Now, what happens is, let's discuss first about the right side of the heart. We have the right atrium, and then we have the right ventricle. Here we have the left ventricle, atrium, and then we have the left ventricle. Now, these atriums are separated by the ventricles by the atrioventricular valves, even though one is called the mitral valve or bicuspid valve, and the right side is called tricuspid valve, but since they're separating the atriums from the ventricles, they're also called the atrioventricular valves. Now, with that being said, once the blood from the atriums is into the ventricles and the ventricles pump the blood into the arteries, the right side of the heart is going to pump the blood through, well, we'll talk about that valve, into the pulmonary artery, but there is a valve present over there also. Because remember, there are four chambers of the heart and there are four valves of the heart. So there is one valve for each chamber of the heart. And the reason we have one valve for each chamber of the heart, because the valves are working as a door. It's like a door which is making sure that there is only one-way blood flow throughout the heart. Now, on the right side of the heart, from the right ventricle, when the blood needs to be pumped into the pulmonary artery, there is one valve present over here which is called, which valve? The pulmonary valve, because it is the pulmonary artery, and pulmonary means lungs, which means this artery is taking the blood to the lungs. Now you can see that this artery basically divides into two. This is the left pulmonary artery and this is the right pulmonary artery, because each artery is taking the blood to each lung. The reason for that is because the blood that is draining into the right atrium, then into the right ventricle, is deoxygenated, and it needs to be pumped into the lungs in order to pick up the oxygen. Now, from the ventricles, the blood is pumped into the pulmonary trunk or the pulmonary artery through the valve, which is called the pulmonary valve. Okay, but on the left side, from the left ventricle, it is pumped into the aorta, and very simple, this is called the aortic valve. But we also call them the semilunar valves collectively. And the reason for that is because they somehow resemble the half moon, as you can see. I don't know if you're seeing something else, depending on your gender. Well, anyways, so let's just do a quick overview again. So we have two atriums, and then we have two ventricles. Both atriums are separated with the ventricles by two valves. On the right side is the tricuspid valve. On the left side, it is the bicuspid valve, or the proper name is the mitral valve. And once the blood is in the ventricles, it needs to be pumped out. Like I said, atriums always receive the blood, and the ventricles always pump out the blood. Once the blood is in the ventricles, it needs to be pumped out of the ventricles. On the left side, it is pumped into the aorta, into systemic circulation, but on the right side, it is pumped into the pulmonary artery, so it can go into the lung. Now, with that being said, let's talk about the basic blood flow. Like, let's start with the blood is basically returning to the heart, and what is the normal, physiologically proper channel that the blood flows into your heart, right? So what happens is that your superior vena cava and your inferior vena cava, well, basically it's the one vena cava actually, and because it's on top we call it superior, it's on the bottom we call it inferior, is draining on the right side of the heart. On the right side, it is draining into the right atrium. Like I said, the atriums always receive the blood. Now, the blood that is draining into the right atrium is deoxygenated, which means it is poor in oxygen and it needs to pick up the oxygen. Now, when it reaches the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve, it will go into the right ventricle. Now, I'm not going into details that what causes the valves to open, what causes the atrial contraction, that we'll discuss in the cardiac cycle lecture. I'm only talking about very, very basic here, that basically the blood is drained in the right side of the heart, which is oxygen poor blood, from the atrium into the ventricle and through the pulmonary valve right into the pulmonary trunk, which goes in the pulmonary artery to each part of the lung. Now, the blood that goes into the lung picks up the oxygen and it needs to return back to the heart, which is oxygen-rich blood, which is denoted here with the red color. Now, this comes back to the left atrium through the pulmonary veins. Now, I said that any vessel that brings the blood closer to the heart is called the veins, and any vessel that takes the blood away from the heart is called the arteries. Now, in these cases, the ventricles was pumping the blood away from the heart, this in the systemic circulation and this in the pulmonary circulation. But now, once the blood has been oxygenated in the lungs, for example, the blood came into the right atrium, then in the right ventricle, and then pumped into the pulmonary trunk, goes to each part of the lung, gets oxygenated. Through the pulmonary veins, it will flow back into left atrium. Now, when it comes into the left atrium, the blood that is present over there is very rich in oxygen. It's oxygenated blood. So, from the left atrium, through the mitral valve, it will come into the left ventricle. Now, the primary reason, even though the cardiac events that are happening on the both sides of the heart are similar, so the atriums are contracting at the same time, the ventricles are contracting at the same time, there are similar actions happening, but the output that is happening is slightly different, because the right side of the heart is pumping the blood in the pulmonary circulation and the left side of the heart is pumping the blood in the systemic circulation. Now, you can see that I have drawn, you can see like a muscle, there's a cardiac muscle that is present around, and it's a lot thicker on the left side than to the right side, which is logically makes sense because the right side of the heart needs to only pump blood to the lungs. So if your heart is basically present over here and lungs over here, like I mentioned earlier, there's not as much that blood needs to be pumped. But in the case of the left side of the heart, the blood needs to be pumped in the systemic circulation throughout your body. So there needs to be extremely high pressure system, and the ventricle needs to contract ferociously or aggressively, okay? Which is why we have a higher muscular mass over here. We will discuss about this, that how this muscle is divided, or cardiac muscle is divided into different layers. For example, the myocardium, the pericardium, and the endocardium over here. But that is for later. First, I want you to understand some other things. I want you to understand that the reason that the heart is divided into 4 compartments, not the reason the compartments, the reason that the valves are present is that the heart is basically making sure that the blood is flowing in the proper direction. As you can see from the arrows, there should not be any regurgitation. So when the ventricles contract, the blood should not be going back into the atriums, which means when the ventricles contract, these valves need to close. And that we will discuss in the lecture of cardiac cycle, that as the pressure increases in the ventricles, it causes the valves to close. Now, these valves open and close, all 4 of them, 2 over here, which is called the atrioventricular valves, and 2 over here, which are the semilunar valves, to make sure that the blood is efficiently flowing through the heart. Now let's talk about the different layers of the muscles, cardiac muscle, that are present. Let's talk about the outermost layer that is present over here. Now that is called the pericardium. The peri means the perimeter and the cardium means the heart. So it's basically the outermost layer of the heart. Now this is a thick fibrous tissue, and you know your heart is protected by the vertebrae, the sternum and the rib cage, but on top of that, the pericardium is more like a sac. So it's like an envelope. It's like covering the heart, and your heart sits right into it, and it's enclosed into it, and it protects the heart. There's another function that the pericardium performs. When your heart is contracting and relaxing, the pericardium makes sure that your heart doesn't overexpand. So for example, your heart can only expand this much, not this much. That would be a pathology. Now that is the function of pericardium, to prevent the overexpansion of the heart. So now we know what is pericardium. Pericardium is the outermost layer of the heart, number 1. Number 2, it is made of thick fibrous tissue. Number 3, it prevents the excessive expansion of the heart during the cardiac cycle. Okay? Let's talk about the other layer, which is the most vital layer, which is the myocardium. The myocardium is basically the one that you can see over here. It is present all around the atriums and the ventricles, and it is basically striated muscle. Now what is a striated muscle? Striated muscles are basically muscle that is present in the form of bands, thick bands, and dark and light bands. Okay, so these bands are arranged in a fashion that they twist and turn and provide the most optimum contractions to direct the blood flow in the right direction. Now what I mean by that is, imagine this. This is the heart, okay, and the myocardium, we are talking about this layer. We are done with the pericardium, which is preventing excessive expansion. Myocardium is the vital part of the vital layer of the cardiac muscle that is basically playing a role in the contraction of the heart. Now the myocardium is basically arranged in the form of bands, and in the lower part of the heart, it is covering the lower part of the heart in different kind of bands, and it's twisting and turning depending on which part of the cardiac cycle we are in, and the blood needs to go, and which part of the heart needs to contract. Now what causes the contraction? That we will discuss in the lecture of electrical conduction system. There's certain cells over here which are called the pacemaker cells. Well, the SA node is present over here. We will discuss that in cardiac cycle, but for now you just trust me that I'm right, that the myocardium is responsible for the contraction of the cardiac, your heart, cardiac muscle. Now let's talk about the innermost layer of the heart, which is called the endocardium. If you zoom in a little bit, yeah, because it's a little bit hard to see even for me from up here, you can see that I've drawn like the blue layer. You know, this blue layer is covering all the atriums and ventricles, the internal lining. Now what is that? This is a very smooth squamous epithelial lining, made of epithelial cells, and the primary function of this is basically to provide a smooth blood flow within the 4 chambers of the heart. Because remember, the blood is flowing through the chambers of the heart, and we don't want any kind of rough surface over there, and we don't want any turbulence. So this squamous epithelial smooth lining made up of epithelial cells is making sure that the blood is smoothly flowing inside the heart, and endo means inside because it's present inside, and that's why it's called endocardium. Cardium means heart. So the 3 layers are endocardium, the myocardium, and the pericardium. Let's review quickly. The endocardium is the innermost layer made up of smooth squamous epithelial cells to prevent the turbulence, and to make sure that there is smooth blood flow through the heart. Then we have the myocardium, which is a striated muscle. What are striated muscles? They are basically elongated fibers made up of bands that, in this case, present in the cardiac muscle. They are twisting and turning and contracting in the most optimum way to direct the blood flow where it needs to be directed in the proper direction. And to prevent the overexpansion of the heart and to provide protection to the heart, we have the pericardium. Now, we are done with the 4 chambers of the heart. There's one more thing that I want to discuss that most people, some people might not know. You know that I said that the valve that is separating the right atrium from the right ventricle is called the tricuspid valve because it has 3 cusps, one cusp like this, one cusp like this, and one cusp like this. So it's opening and shutting like that, right? The semilunar valves, which are also called, well, the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve, because this is the pulmonary artery and this is the aorta, they also have three cusps, both of them. So all three valves, the valve present on the right heart, between the atrioventricular valve and the two semilunar valves, all have three cusps. But we still call this specific valve the tricuspid valve, and we don't refer to them as tricuspid valve. But it's just a little information that I thought you might know. Now, let's go through the basic labeling of the diagram that is present over here. So this is the superior vena cava. We have the right pulmonary artery. We have the endocardium. We talked about that. We have the right atrium. Well, let's talk in the proper fashion, okay? We have the right atrium. We have the right ventricle. We have the right atrium and the left atrium. We have the right ventricle and the left ventricle, right? Then we have the two valves. This valve is called the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve, and this valve is called the tricuspid valve. Then we have the semilunar valves. In this case, this is the pulmonary valve and this is the aortic valves. And what is the function of the valves? The function of the valves, well, two functions. First, to make sure that there is no regurgitation. The blood is not flowing back. So there's only one-way blood flow through the heart. So if blood is flowing in this way, it will only flow in this direction. It won't flow back. That would be a pathology. Now, there's something that you need to understand. If you can zoom in a little bit over here. Okay, you can see those green thread-like structures. Now, what are those? These are very strong, you can say, fibers that are attached to the valves, and the function of that is to basically hold the valves in its place. Because remember, I said the atriums are not a very high pressure system, but the ventricles are a very high pressure system. They contract with a lot higher force because they need to pump the blood at a higher distance. So imagine if the both ventricles are pumping, especially on the left ventricle, wouldn't this valve, there's a good chance that this valve will flip back and just open like that, and the blood could regurgitate back. Now, that is prevented by these fibers, which is called the chordae tendineae, okay, which is the Latin name for that, or tendinous cords, we can call them that too. So chordae tendineae are present over here to prevent that and to make sure that the valves stay in place. Now let's quickly talk about the proper blood flow. Then we'll talk about the basic principles of the blood flow in the heart. But first, let's quickly overview that. So what is the blood flow in the heart? The deoxygenated blood is draining on the right side of the heart from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava into the right atrium. From the right atrium, we have an atrial contraction. Now I'll start to go a little advanced. The pacemaker cells, there's an SA node that fires. We have an atrial contraction. We'll go in detail in cardiac cycle. The atrial contraction pumps the blood into the right ventricle. The right ventricle, this is deoxygenated blood we're talking about right now. The right ventricle pumps the blood in the pulmonary artery, pulmonary trunk, through the pulmonary valve. And that further divides into two, the right pulmonary artery, the left pulmonary artery, to each part of the lungs. From the lungs, the blood basically gives off the carbon dioxide and picks up the oxygen and gets oxygenated and then drains back into the left side of the heart. So you have to understand the blood deoxygenated comes on the right side of the heart, then from there through the pulmonary artery goes to the lungs, and from the lungs picks up the oxygen and then drains back into the left side of the heart, which is the left atrium, and through the mitral valve or the atrioventricular valve or the bicuspid valve, whatever you want to call it, pick your fancy, pick your poison, it will be coming into the left ventricle, and left ventricle needs to pump the blood in the systemic circulation, which is at a much higher distance, and hence we have a higher muscular mass over here, and then the blood will go into the systemic circulation and the story will repeat itself. Again, it will come back, and that is pretty much it. This concludes our lecture for basically the basic overview, and we have discussed the basic anatomical terminology, and now we know that which part of the heart, what are the chambers, what are the valves, and what are the difference between the arteries and the veins. And after the break, we'll go in the lecture and we'll discuss about the cardiac cycle and what are the events that take place during one cardiac cycle, which is one systole and one diastole. Thank you very much for watching.